Hi, I'm R.R. Moore, and welcome to Info Prime. Here I hope to provide you with information not normally available, or at least enhance your understanding on a wide variety of topics. This installment offers information on Hi. Well, I assume, learned about Paul Revere in school. You know him, the American patriot and hero of the American Revolutionary War. The guy who rode to warn the colonials that the British are coming, the British are coming. The man who did the one if by land, two if by sea lantern thing. That Paul Revere. As is all too often the case, the actual events in history are far different than what we are taught. This is one of those cases. Paul Revere languished in the forgotten dustbin of history as merely a footnote until some 85 years after Revere's famous ride. Why was Paul Revere for so long kept in the background of American history, and what changed that? The why Revere was almost lost to history we'll get to as this piece continues. But the what caused his story to be in our minds even today is fairly straightforward. In 1860, some 85 years after Revere's ride, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a wildly popular poem, Paul Revere's Ride. People seemed not to be able to get enough of it. Today, we often hear this poem's title as The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. That title is actually the name of a painting and not the name of the poem. The poem, Paul Revere's Ride, was later incorporated into a book by Longfellow, the title of which is The Tales of a Wayside Inn, published in 1863. The poem is actually written as a narrative by the landlord of the Wayside Inn. With this poem, Revere was launched into being a prominent figure, a hero actually, of the American Revolution. Longfellow wrote the poem as the Civil War was looming. His intent was to bring about a patriotic feeling toward the Union by offering us a true American hero. And his intent seemed to work, and worked very well. In his poem, the fourth line from the last, he writes, "In the hour of darkness and peril and need." People of his time were aware that this was a warning of sorts of the coming strife to the nation. But was Revere really a hero of the Revolutionary War? Well, let's take a look and see for ourselves. Before continuing, it should be noted that Longfellow, being a poet, seems to have taken the oft-used term poetic license to a high degree. Here are just a couple of examples of uses of such poetic license. As to the what if by sea line, the poem offers that the signal was for Revere to let him know how the British were coming. In fact, it was Revere himself who ordered that lanterns were to be placed in the Old North Church, officially Christ Church, in Boston, to be a signal that the British were on the move. And there were only two lanterns, not one for if by land and two for if by sea. The poem speaks to Revere being the sole writer spreading the news. There were in fact three separate men involved with this ride alone. There were of course other poetic license takes on the actual history by Longfellow, but those two should suffice for now. Paul Revere was a staunch colonialist. He was an active member of the Sons of Liberty and actively worked to protest the Stamp Act. This act by the British placed a tax on every piece of printed paper used by the colonists. No one but the British was happy in the least. Protests were common. In fact, Paul Revere was one of those involved in the Boston Tea Party. During his adult years, he had several professions. One of Revere's jobs, as it were, was a dentist of sorts. He made false teeth. His ad was not a bit humble, it seems, but it worked for a while and worked very well. And no, he never made false teeth for George Washington. He also worked as an engraver. He was accused once by Henry Pelham, another engraver, of plagiarism in Revere's engraving The Boston Massacre. Paul Revere, however, was best known as a prominent silversmith of his day. If you can find examples of his silverwork today, they are worth a small fortune. Now, on to Revere's ride. First, as I mentioned earlier, there were actually 3 people involved in the mission Revere undertook. Paul Revere, of course, William Dawes, who joined Revere in Lexington, and in a wholly separate but very short ride, Dr. Samuel Prescott. He lived in Concord. Prescott was visiting in Lexington when Revere made his ride and decided to join in. Revere's mission was laid out for him by Dr. Joseph Warren. Revere was to warn the colonial forces in Concord, Massachusetts. Dawes had left earlier by a longer route to accomplish the same mission. There in Concord was stored a large cache of weapons. The British, with a force of between 1,200 and 1,500 troops, were on their way to Concord to capture the munitions. Another important part of this mission was to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock of the British intent to arrest both of them in Lexington. Revere's ride started late on April 18, 1775, and continued through the night. With that mission at hand, let's take a mental ride-along with old Paul and see what actually happened. First, the trip from Boston to Lexington is about 20 miles long, and you have to go another 7 or 8 miles to get to Concord. Back then, of course, one couldn't take the Mass Pike from Boston to Route 128, or I-95 if you prefer, and head north to Lexington and Concord. You rode a horse, so it took a while. And Revere, of course, started out in Boston. A few days before April 18th, Revere had instructed Robert Newman, the sexton of the Old North Church, to send a signal of 2 lanterns, not the oneth by land, tweth by sea, to alert colonialists in Charlestown as to the movements of the British troops when information was known. By the time Revere reached Charlestown, the British troop movement had begun. Thus, the lantern signal was not needed. Paul Revere started out his famous ride by walking all the way across Boston's north end to the Charles River. He then crossed the Charles River, being rowed by 2 friends to Charlestown. Once in Charlestown, Revere met with members of the Sons of Liberty. He needed a horse, of course. Sorry for that, Mr. Ed. I couldn't help myself. Anyway, Revere owned not a single horse, so he asked to borrow one from John Larkin, one of the Sons of Liberty. Larkin didn't have one either, and had to ask his father, Samuel Larkin, for one. Samuel obliged. Now Revere began his horseback ride in Charlestown on the way to Lexington and Concord. Revere set out for Somerville, Medford, and what is present-day Arlington on the first leg of his ride. Along the way, he warned those he could of the British troop movements. Those he warned also set off to warn others. Altogether, there were approximately 40 riders warning the colonials. It was in Arlington where Revere offered to one there, "The regulars are coming." This is as close as history gets to the famous "The British are coming." Now Revere heads to Lexington where he meets up with Dawes. They meet with Adams and Hancock and successfully warn them both. Then both Dawes and Revere set off toward Concord to complete their mission. Along the way, they meet up with Prescott, who was leaving Lexington to head home to Concord. The 3 run into a group of British soldiers. During the melee, Revere is captured and the other 2 escape. Dawes lost his horse and had to walk back to Lexington. Prescott made it to Concord to issue the warning. And here's where it gets very interesting. Upon Revere's being captured, he was questioned by the British soldiers at gunpoint near Lexington. He told them of the British Army's movement from Boston and that the British Army troops would be in some danger if they approached Lexington because of the large number of hostile militia gathered there. The British then confiscated Revere's horse, and they rode off on Revere's horse to warn the approaching Army column. Revere was escorted east toward Lexington. About a half mile from Lexington, they heard a gunshot. The British major demanded Revere explain the gunfire, and Revere replied it was a signal to alarm the country. As the group drew closer to Lexington, the town bell began to clang rapidly, upon which another British captive proclaimed to the British soldiers, "The bells are ringing, the town's alarmed, and you're all dead men." The British soldiers gathered and decided not to continue towards Lexington, but instead they freed the prisoners they had, including Revere, and headed back to warn the British commanders. Providing what is called actionable intel to the enemy is not exactly Homeric as far as heroes go. After all, Revere was not tortured nor harmed in any way. Revere obviously never completed his mission. And that, believe it or not, is the end of the story of Paul Revere's famous ride. If interested in this topic, there are two names which are of significant importance, much more so than Paul Revere. The first is a true hero, or more appropriately, a heroine. She was a 16-year-old girl who, about 2 years after Revere's ride, made a similar ride to warn the colonialists. Her ride was twice as long as Revere's. She was not captured. She did not give information to the enemy, and was completely successful. Her name was Sybil Ludington. Look her up. Next, we have the long-distance winner. About the same time as Revere made his ride, a man, Israel Bissell, rode from Watertown, Massachusetts, all the way to Philadelphia, virtually non-stop, to warn of the approaching British Army. That's 345 miles worth of riding a horse. His cry as he rode, to arms, the war has begun." His is an interesting story as well. I do hope you learned something from this piece of real history. Putting this piece together was a bit more tedious than most I've done. This was due to there being no contemporary to his time reports or writings of Paul Revere's ride that I could find, save for Paul Revere's own personal notes. His notes, I found, were not the most forthcoming, as it were. I had to cobble together the story from multiple sources, many which were in disagreement with each other. I selected those items which I could find multiple sources in agreement. At the onset of this piece, I mentioned that Revere's story, prior to Longfellow's poem, was relegated to the footnotes in history's dustbin. Revere, in mind and deed, was supportive of America's break from Britain, but he did not complete his mission. Others of his time with similar intent were successful. He gave valuable information to the enemy, others did not. His actions were less than noteworthy and far from being heroic. Were it not for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Paul Revere's story would be the opposite of the TV show Cheers slogan, as in, Paul Revere, please meet history, the place where nobody knows your name. Hi again. I hope this installment has been beneficial to you, and thanks for watching.